The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
We filmed this ceramic class. I wish we had got to know the people before, because we were really friendly when the camera was off, and they were kind of shy when the camera was on.
Yeah, yeah.
So probably if you went back now, it would be different. But
yeah, and I feel like the boom was really intimidating, because I'd be like, oh, like in their faces and trying to get it, and then you could hear their voices just drop and then cut off whatever they were saying.
Yep.
So yeah, and then I felt uncomfortable because I came in, like Katerina was there for a while before I came in, and then as soon as I got there, I got my camera, and the first time I was talking with people was like behind it. So I don't know. I think I was like more reserved in like what I was asking them and kind of like how close I was getting to them. So I think that's part of just like getting comfortable with it and just. But then I think if I had gotten a chance to talk to some of them, it would have been better.
Yeah, the way a camera changes the situation is pretty amazing, and that's obviously a huge part of what we've been talking about. The boom is also a big part of that, and as you say, especially for people who haven't experienced that before, it can be kind of intimidating because it's sort of like this weapon, right? And the ways around that are, as we discussed in class, you can actually attach the directional microphone to the top of the camera, which at least makes it more of a compact unit. You do sacrifice some ability to get really good sound in certain situations because you can't get the microphone as close, obviously, since it's limited to wherever the camera is. But it does have the advantage that there's only one sort of intimidating piece of equipment in the room, not two. And it's more contained. So that is something that you might consider for some kinds of situations, and it may or may not be appropriate. And then, of course, the other thing is, prepping the room, prepping the scene, meeting the people. Again, depending on how much time you have, meeting them without a camera before you take the camera out. As I think I said before, I'll often come with a camera, but I won't necessarily be committed to the idea of taking it out the first time I meet people, because you just have to see how it goes. And if it seems really great and they're very comfortable and you make a lot of progress, you can say, oh, do you mind if I shoot something? But if there is that kind of need to build a rapport before you get to that point, you just leave the camera in the bag, and then if something amazing is starting to happen, you have it. But I realize also that in an exercise situation, you're not necessarily going to spend a week or two building a rapport with a ceramics class before you go out and shoot. But part of what we're doing here is trying to get some experience in these different kinds of shooting and just get an idea of some of the challenges involved in the different kinds of things.
And one other thing, we talked about this a little bit before, but if you did say have someone with the camera, as Chris mentioned, with the unidirectional, the longer mic on top, it could still be helpful to have two people. Because in that instance, one person could be focusing on shooting it, and the other person could be focusing on just sort of interacting with people. And then that gives people in the ceramics class, then, or whatever the situation is, somebody to focus on, as opposed to focusing on whoever has the equipment. So sometimes that helps people become a lot more comfortable. So sort of one person can be in charge of sort of, socially, engaging with whoever it is that you're working with, and the other person can focus on the shooting and the sound.
And then another thing that you can do, which we don't really have the equipment to do in this class, but if you had, for instance, a digital audio recorder of your own, the other person could carry the digital audio recorder and a microphone just handheld, and that's a little less intimidating as well, and you can obviously get closer or get a different sound angle where you can record the sound separately and then sync it up in editing. So that's yet another technique that you could use to get a different kind of audio perspective without using the boom and being as intimidating. The boom is great for some situations, obviously, but it does introduce another element of distraction. So the other thing that I wanted to do is talk a little bit more about Errol Morris, just kind of wrap that up since we were a little truncated on Wednesday. And then we're going to go on to talk about this current assignment a bit more. We're going to get a visit from a dean, Christopher Jones, who's going to talk a little bit about MIT students. And we're also going to talk about interview techniques and various things to think about when you're setting up an interview. So that's today. But just first to spend a few minutes thinking about Errol Morris, or wrapping that up. Final reactions or thoughts that people didn't get a chance to say to his work or to that final film, The Fog of War?
It was interesting how he actually used a lot of jump cuts
Mm-hmm.
to like it really was different from like normal films. That he's a very famous person. It's not like it's something he just put together, but it's interesting to include like his own voice randomly, not randomly, but
Mm-hmm.
at different points, and then have it just jump between things and other.
Mm-hmm.
I think in one of the other films when they had jump cuts, like he fade out and then fade in.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in this one he kind of just didn't do that as much, or at least
Yep.
shorter.
Yeah.
And I liked it because it was a good example of kind of like what to do with my last piece, because it was really based on what the person was saying, and then I would cut, and so I was having difficulties because I didn't want it to sound like this random voice from nowhere, and so I kept trying to go back to the person, but then after looking at it, I was like, oh, it's so much of her. I really wanted to like show more of the food as well. So I think watching him, it was a really good balance, and there's actually more of everything else than on him. So, but I didn't feel like I didn't know who he was when he was talking. So I think that helped at least figure out how to do some of that. I'm not exactly sure how he did it though. I think probably looking through it again.
Other thoughts?
I was just going to mention in relation to Sabrina's comment, so the focus on the jump cuts, for example. So when we're thinking again the contrast between digital cinema style, between direct cinema style and Errol Morris's style, again, the direct cinema style is much more focusing less on the editing. I mean, obviously editing is still part of it, but less of a focus on the editing, and you don't really want to call attention to it. And generally, you don't call attention also to the person who's doing the filming. So in both of those cases, again, him breaking very strongly with direct cinema style, where doing jump cuts, calling attention to the fact that this is being filmed, that this is being staged, hearing his voice off camera.
Well, you can sort of think about it as in a lot of ways, all documentary filmmakers in one way or another are in conversation with this question of the artifice of filmmaking. So they're taking something that is reality and they're trying to represent it through this medium that is about artifice and manipulation. And the direct cinema approach is to sort of minimize the sense in which there's a manipulation, whether or not it's true that there is. And Errol Morris is saying, I'm just going to put it out there. I'm editing. This is edited here. This is my interpretation of what was said, and I am manipulating what was said, and I'm showing you where I cut things out, and I'm not going to worry about it. The other thing that's interesting about his work, for better or worse, is if you think back to some of the very early stuff we saw, like that film on the Whirlwind computer from the 50s with the voiceover narration, the voice of God narration. In some ways, his technique is very similar to that, except that it's not a voice of God, yet the voice is really located in the subject. But he, in so many ways, is illustrating what's being said with cutaways, with found footage or sort of various kinds of imagery. But it's, rather than being sort of a literal illustration, in many cases, it's more of a psychological or a very, very subjective illustration. And the music, of course, the Philip Glass music in that piece really highlights that and increases the feeling of sort of subjective dislocation, if that's the right term.
So would you say there is much more planning before even starting to shoot a Morris style kind of film, whereas with direct cinema there is only how much planning do you do before with a direct cinema experiment?
I think it's hard to say. how you would answer that, because it really depends on exactly what you're doing. The planning in the case of an Errol Morris film is picking the right subject, picking someone who will hold up under that kind of intense scrutiny as a human being, as a personality, who's engaging enough to carry a film. And many of his films obviously aren't carried by a single individual, but all of them are kind of about people who can talk in some way or another. Whether or not they can talk in the sense of being very articulate, and of course McNamara is very articulate in that film, but some of his characters are just very compelling in other ways, not because they're necessarily so able to speak, but they're compelling characters. And so there's a huge amount of pre-production in picking the right people to tell the story, and picking a story that lends itself well to that technique. And then after that, it's sort of interesting because is it pre-production work or is it post-production work? Because there's so much work and attention that has to be done to structuring a story when you do it like that. What are the linking bits? How do you get people, and this is what we'll talk about later in class, how do you get people to tell their story in a coherent way, or in a way that can be made coherent in editing? So for instance, if I'm interviewing Chris and I want to get her life history, and I say, when were you born? And she says, 1960, whatever it was,
65.
And 65. I can't really use that unless you include my question. So I need her to say, I was born in 1965. And then hopefully to make some kind of observation on why that might even be interesting. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about in the last half of class. How do you actually do things like that? What kinds of basic techniques can you use to get people to talk about themselves or about whatever you're asking them about?
Just one, I think probably maybe what Katerina is trying to get at, there is, we were talking some about how Errol Morris likes to use sets, and so and there is discussion in some of the readings, for example, when he was shooting Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, that he did these nighttime shoots with the topiary, and he wanted to do it in slower speed. So there's massive, massive numbers of lights. So in that sense, yeah, a lot of emphasis for Errol Morris, depending on what he's shooting on creating sets, on creating the context for how he wants things to look.
Because again, he's not afraid of embracing the artificial
exactly
qualities of film.
And thinking also about in Gates of Heaven, when he created those portraits, obviously, when he was shooting interviews with people, he was spending a lot of time, in the setup beforehand. What exactly do I want to have in the background? How do I frame this in a way that's actually absolutely right? So there was a great deal of emphasis placed on setting up those interviews before he even interviewed them. So in that sense, yeah, there is a lot more sort of planning. Whereas the direct cinema style being more, okay, let's grab the camera, let's hop into, there's people doing stuff, let's just hop right in and follow them along and do whatever. So
direct cinema,
in that sense, yeah.
the planning can involve access.
Right.
You think about
Yes.
Primary. I don't know the story, but it may or may not have been easy to get the kind of access that they needed in order to follow Humphrey and Kennedy, or any kind of film. Obviously, there's a lot of negotiation that has to go on before you can even be in the room with people that are that are sort of free to be themselves, and that would allow you to actually capture something direct cinema style. So it can vary, but yeah, certainly in terms of the experience of filming, one is about spontaneity and being, well, they both can be about spontaneity, but one is sort of about being freewheeling and not trying to direct and embrace this sort of artifice, the plastic elements of film that we talked about at the beginning. And the other is very much like, well, that's what film is, why not? So at 11, we're going to have a visit from Dean Christopher Jones, who's going to talk a little bit about MIT students. And just to prep for that, I wanted to talk a bit about the second part of the assignment. As I said, I'm encouraging you to, for the second part of this exercise, which is an interview-based exercise, I'm encouraging your teams to interview an MIT student. And this may become part of a project that I'm working on, which is essentially a profile of the MIT student body, which is going to be shown in at various events as part of the MIT 150 celebration that's happening right now, including possibly before this big convocation that's happening at the Boston Convention Center in April. So it's kind of fun. It could be kind of cool. And what I'm interested in is sort of the idea of how MIT students look at MIT students, both graduate and undergraduate, no distinction, although obviously there is a difference. I'm just kind of interested in the question of is there a typical MIT student? Are there characteristics that cross sort of traditional boundaries of ethnicity or gender or age or interest or it's kind of it's a truism to say that MIT students are just an incredibly diverse lot when it comes to their interests and their goals and their aims in life, and I'm just kind of interested in seeing what MIT students think about that. So I would strongly encourage you to, if you're at all interested, to participate in that. Dean Jones is going to talk a little bit about strategies for that as well. And I'm also, the second part of this is I would very much love to have the opportunity to film you filming. So if you're able to do this and you actually want to profile an MIT student, again, grad or undergrad, and it's very open as to who you might choose, I would love to be able to come and spend a very short amount of time, not the entire time, because we know how cameras can influence those kinds of things. But I would love to come capture just a little bit of you actually doing the exercise. So we can talk about this offline or separately, but over the next week, I would love to try to, if possible, coordinate schedules to do that. Also in advance of the exercise, I wanted to show you a film that was made here at MIT, or show you a few minutes of a film that was made in 1957. Maybe some of you have seen it, although probably not, called The Social Beaver. Has anybody heard of this film? Which is a very interesting example of kind of how MIT views itself or not. You'll recognize, some of the techniques that we've discussed in class, like especially in the first part of class. But I'm just going to show like the first 7 or 8 minutes, and then we can talk a little bit about it.
The Charles River in Massachusetts separates Boston from the famous university city of Cambridge. Here, stretching for a mile along the north bank, is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, known the world over as MIT. This famous university offers to its students intellectual challenge together with fellowship. MIT, founded in 1861 by William Barton Rogers, a distinguished natural scientist, has, for a century, been a leader in the development of science and technology. Today, devoted to the highest goals of education and research, MIT is a new type of educational institution, a modern university built around science and technology rather than classical studies, but embracing the arts, the social sciences, and the humanities. The campus contains 100 acres. The main educational group of buildings centered around the Great Court is a single continuous structure, although it is divided into numbered sections referred to as buildings. MIT's campus is all-inclusive with an extensive athletic plant and playing fields fully accessible. So are the recreational buildings, dormitories, and dining halls. It is a pleasant place in which to work and live. The dormitory system permits students of all classes to live in any of the undergraduate houses. The Dorrance Laboratory houses food technology and biology and is a leader in biophysical and biochemical research. The swimming pool and squash courts occupy this building. The Institute provides this beautiful home for its presidents. Walker Memorial houses a large student dining hall and is the Student Activities Center. The Charles Hayden Memorial Library is the center of the Institute Library System. The facilities for study at MIT are fine, but these able and vigorous students need many extracurricular activities to complete their development for future communal, family, and social relationships. Symbolized by the mascot beaver, engineer of the animal world, the active student after classes is indeed the social beaver, for MIT offers him complete fulfillment. A large student living group resides in the dormitories and enjoys a type of community living. Roommates work together harmoniously. Apartments are provided in each dormitory for a faculty resident and his wife, who live among the students and open their apartments to them for evening bull sessions, snacks, and general sociability. Numerous lounges are available to the students. Dormitory living provides unlimited opportunities for working and playing together. Throughout the Institute's living groups, emphasis is placed on the individual, yet each student is exposed to many different philosophies and ideas. Chess is popular. There are rooms for ping pong, billiards, cards, music, and photography. Dorm parties are unique. This is driftwood drag. Dormitory Council governs the dormitory system. Each house has its own committee to plan dances, student-faculty coffee hours, and intramural sports. MIT has over 25 local and national fraternities, each with its own house. In this living group, informal bull sessions are always taking place, with the talk ranging from nuclear fission to girls. Each house must, of necessity, offer the atmosphere and conditions conducive to study. Each fraternity member is provided with a quiet study area, an adequate desk, and of course, the inevitable hi-fi set is close by. Mutual aid in studies is sought and cheerfully given. Every fraternity has a full slate of officers and holds periodic meetings of its members. Each house conducts its affairs in business-like manner. Before the freshman quizzes, it is customary in most houses for upperclassmen to give formal review sessions. About 100 co-eds attend MIT and participate in all aspects of student affairs. The girls have their own social rooms in the main school building. Inside this door, it's strictly no men allowed. Here the co-eds congregate between classes and relax from the pressure of classwork. Among other things, this is the girls' communication center. In typical feminine fashion, the girls take time out to gossip about clothes and dates, exchange news, and congratulate or sympathize with one another about their grades. MIT co-eds are gifted musically, too, and relax in this enjoyable manner after finishing with gossiping and other talk. When studying in the horizontal, one must be prepared to accept this consequence. The Margraccini room is actually a beautifully appointed suite of rooms. Besides the large living room, there is a locker room, fully equipped kitchen, and this special study room. Here the girls study in complete silence, and the signs of intense concentration are evident. Well, most of the time anyway. After all, the studious beaver is also the social beaver. And what is more natural than planning and daydreaming about that new evening gown? The women's dormitory at 120 Bay State Road is comfortable and homelike. Here, the girls share in the work and play that is typical of girls' dorms everywhere. On a weekend, the living room is likely to look like this.
So, anyway, so that's how MIT represented itself in 1957. Thoughts?
Do you guys need some space to go relax from the pressure? Anyway.
It was interesting because like they didn't show a lot of the building inside. They showed the outside, which made it look really beautiful. Whereas, you know, MIT is ranked like in the past like #1 sore eye school.
Yeah.
So yeah, like the fact that they want it to look really beautiful and really ideal and
On a nice spring day when all the flowers are blooming.
yeah, like when has that ever happened?
People aren't really around to take photos. Like, you don't see them, like,
I mean,
hanging out
maybe
like
they
that.
were there then, but there's a lot of people out there.
But like, it was weird also when they cut between places, like you kind of knew where like some of the plaques were, but they weren't all like near each other. And so like they cut to 7th and Mass Ave, and then Killian, you know, back and forth, and they show different things on like engraved, I guess, or I don't know what they call them, in the buildings. But like it was all like not near each other per se. So like you kind of, if you didn't know where it was, it's kind of weird when you kind of know where it is. So it's like all over, you're jumping back and forth. But
When was it shot?
It came out in 1957, so I assume it was shot around that time or right before, yeah. It was produced by an alum from the class of 1922. So he was already, you know, in his late 50s when he made this. That's an interesting question, you know, what would the students of that time have thought about this film? I mean, it was obviously pretty typical in terms of its technique and its style for the time, so it's not that it would have been seen as so sort of outrageous the way we might look at it, but I would have been curious to know what the current student body would have thought about it.
Well, basically, it doesn't really say anything about the social life of students in MIT. It's a promotional video
Right.
about how great MIT students are, but do we see any evidence of this? No.
It's obviously this sort of voice of God narration that we talked about at the beginning of class, and then everything is illustrated. But even the things that they choose to focus on are, you know, it's all infrastructure. You know, the women's dorm is at 120 Bay State Road. Here's the special lounge. Here's this building. Here's this building. Here's this building. So yeah, it's very interesting that the social life of the student is kind of all communicated via infrastructure.
But then I think, you know, I mean, the same way that MIT does now, I mean, so much of this is intended to try to counter other stereotypes about sort of science and engineering students to be completely asocial. I mean, that's the whole point. And so deliberately showing shots of sort of, You know, I mean, most of the shots, I mean, you know, so there's the students being social, but it's also, you know, a lot of, you know, young men and young women together. You know, I mean, you know, with the intent of deliberately trying to counter other stereotypes that would have.
Well, just the fact that I mean, as sort of retro and obviously, you know, sexist as that portrayal is, just the fact that there's so much emphasis on the fact that women attend MIT, because
But how many women? Like, doesn't mean
only 100.
Yeah, only 100.
But they were proud of the fact at that point that there were 100, because if you go back 5 or 6 years before, there were like 17.
And you know, before that, it was really sort of MIT was the sort of the men's school here, and sort of its partner school, quote unquote, was Wellesley. That's why there's still this ongoing connection with Wellesley. So that was sort of the idea, was that the MIT students would, so social events there were between Wellesley and MIT.
You wonder if they were trying to like, because like they show the girls doing some more silly stuff than the guys doing. But you wonder how much of that was trying to like say, oh look, they're normal, or trying to insult. Maybe like it's probably different culture.
I think they were trying to say they're normal. Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
But as you say, I mean, the language, the first thing that they say coming into, oh, here's the space where the young women go to relax from the pressure. I mean, that's not what they say when they introduce the young guys going into their dorms. I mean, I mean, it is pretty.
They're gonna fall asleep and
Yeah.
the guys don't,
Here they
but the
gossip.
guys study together.
Yeah.
Yes.
The whole thing was a disaster.
Sorry?
The whole thing was a disaster, basically. They said one thing that
Yeah.
I didn't even listen.
They never even mentioned any type of like study they did at all. Whereas the guys are like,
they're like, oh look,
like
they're studying. No,
fission
they're not.
and
Yeah. Well, it's. I mean, they're walking a fine line here, because I'm sure they're very aware that a lot of the audience is going, why would women go to MIT at all? What are they doing studying engineering and science? My goodness, that seems wrong. So they're trying to make it like, oh, but it's, you know, there's this friendly home-like environment where they live, and they have this special lounge where they can relax from the pressure. But at the same time, they're also aware that another segment of their audience is saying it's even at that time, you know, it's outrageous that only 100 women attend MIT, and so they're trying to be very political and not succeeding very well. But
Yeah.
So when did the Walker, I mean, when did the Student Activity Center move to the ugly building?
I don't know. When was it built?
Yeah,
I
when the
have
new
no
student
idea.
sector, I don't know.
I don't know.
But I mean, one question, I mean, I'm not sure exactly if this was one of the directions you wanted to go, but thinking about how diversity at MIT would have been presented at this time and how it would be conceptualized now. I mean, so here, obviously, the only diversity here is, okay, there are women here, and it is completely presented in a heterosexually heterosexually oriented kind of frame, where that's the assumption that this is, okay, we've got women here, you know, and so like you guys can hook up. Kind of is the assumption built into there, and there's not discussion in terms of other kinds of diversity. There's not discussion in terms of class diversity, ethnic and racial diversity, sexual diversity. I mean, so there's a very, you know, how would diversity on campus been conceptualized at that point, in terms of how would it be conceptualized now? In terms of how people think about, well, what entails a diverse student body, and what makes what would be considered to be the ideal composition of the MIT student body.
They do mention the class diversity. So in the dorm, students of all classes.
But I thought, actually, I did the first thing too. I thought they were talking about social class, but I think they meant of all classes, like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior.
Okay.
Yeah.
It wasn't about social classes.
Yeah.
It was.
Because I thought the idea was, you know, Harvard, down the door, down, you know.
No.
I think Cambridge is a very elite place, but in MIT, no matter what you
No.
Well, there was that feeling at the time. I think Chris is right that that's what they were talking about. But MIT, particularly at that time, but continuing, has always seen itself as an institution in comparison to, say, the Ivy Leagues, where social class does not matter, and where it's all about, it's sort of a meritocracy. That's the self-perception, and it doesn't necessarily inform this film. I think that they're very, as Chris said, that what's informing this film is this need, number one, to show off the infrastructure, which is really interesting, and number two, to counter stereotypes of MIT students as people who have no social lives, study all the time. This whole issue that I mentioned of the fact that they want to brag about the fact that there are women there, women at MIT, but they're also worried about alumni who are probably at that time outraged that they've now let in over 100 women, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the sort of overriding purpose of the film.
Yeah.
I have another comment. It doesn't, it shows social life as in student activities, but it doesn't really show social life as people are working.
Mm-hmm.
So as students are in the lab or taking lunch break or even
Mhm.
like talking as they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, I just wonder what kind of choices were you made.
Well, again,
The way the conception of work and
Mm-hmm.
there are two things going on here. Both are very interesting and both relate to this exercise that we're talking about. I mean, one is the stylistic choices, and that is partly just a product of the time. So the way of making a documentary at that point is basically thinking of it as a newsreel. Write a script that says what you want to say, and then illustrate the script. Go out with a camera and a tripod and frame up a bunch of shots that you have on a list, and then write it to the script. So there isn't necessarily a sense of spontaneity or these kinds of issues that we've been talking about, how you get at other kinds of things, either via interviews or via cinema verite, direct cinema kinds of approaches. So that's one thing. But then, yeah, the other thing is how do you represent yourself, and how do you get at the reality of what a particular group of people is? You know, I mean, genre and style aside, it's very, very easy to make the equivalent of this film now. It's just that it wouldn't look like that or sound like that. And one of the things that I'm interested in doing is trying to get you guys to participate a little bit, and so that this is not quite like that. And obviously, you know, what we make now is more palatable to 21st century eyes and ears, but there's still this whole question of representation and, you know, top-down representation, quote unquote, or people who represent themselves. I mean, it's like, you know, indigenous media. Well, we've been having a great conversation about diversity and the MIT educational experience, diversity in its many forms.
Oh,
and it's been really interesting. So you can kind of,
I'm ready to be educated.
You can give your perspective, and then, yeah, just continue the conversation we've been having. But for those of you who don't know Christopher, he's the assistant dean for graduate students. He has a graduate degree from MIT himself, and has been involved for a long time in a number of programs such as the MIT Summer Research Program, MSRP, the Amgen Scholars Program. I know I'm missing a ton, but he spends a great deal of time thinking about the makeup of the graduate student body here, and actively working to recruit students. Yes. So I thought it would be a great thing for him to come in and talk a little bit about some of the stuff we've just been talking about. And just to give you a recap, we talked about the assignment, and then we watched 8 minutes of a film that was made in the 50s here on MIT students, which is quite funny.
I bet it was.
Imagine.
On many levels, right?
Yes, exactly, yeah. And we were just having a really interesting conversation about, as I said, you know, diversity, you know, not just the sort of traditional measures of diversity, but also academic diversity.
Right,
and,
right.
So if you want to speak for a couple minutes, and then
we
can continue the conversation. But
yeah, I'd love to. I think the richness of it is going to be the conversation.
Would you prefer to stand, or would you like a chair?
I don't know. What's better? What do you all usually do? What do you want? I can stand. I can sit.
We do either one.
Yeah, whatever you prefer.
I'll stand up for a little bit.
Okay.
Since I've been sitting all day.
And
then cool. Yeah. I should have been sitting all night too. You have to excuse me. So I don't know if you mentioned, but I'm also in a PhD program here. In addition to being assistant dean, and I have a problem set due today. And I took a nap at 3 o'clock and then got back up to work on it. So I apologize if I'm a little bit off today, but it's good to see you all. Thank you for inviting me. When I heard about the project, I was really excited, and for a number of reasons. One, because I think it's always great. One of the wonderful things about MIT is its ability to get out of the way of student innovation, right? So to really move out of the way and help to facilitate student innovation. And I think this is sort of an example of that. I think we really believe in the strength and the power of the students. So I want to say a couple of things, and then I really want to hear more about you all and engage in a dialogue, if that's okay. And I think the things that I'll say are centered around a question that Chris asked me a while ago, and that was what is a typical MIT student? I don't know if you've had that conversation.
I raised that as a question. But
Yeah.
not really
any answers?
We didn't get there yet.
You didn't get there? Anyone want to throw out anything? Do you believe there is a typical MIT student?
I don't know. I was trying to think of how I would describe it, and I can't really put a gender on it, or a race, or a class, or, you know, primarily they're like a science or engineer student.
But not exclusively, right?
What?
But not exclusively, right?
Not exclusively, and having a diverse set of interests, a little eccentric, intuitive. They're mostly like personality traits.
Yeah.
I think.
So I think one of your challenges is going to be in the midst of such diversity, right? We're from all over the world, at least at the graduate level. And at the undergraduate level, there are about 8% international students, 8 or 9% international students. At the graduate level, about 40% international students. So there are a lot of people from a lot of different places here. And we have all sorts of interests and background. You know, people that love jousting, people that love baking, people that love ballroom dancing, people that love sitting and watching sitcoms all day long after they finish their homework, of course. So we have a huge range of interests, and I think part of your challenge is going to be in the midst of all of that, is there a common thread that sort of ties what seems to be very different individuals together? And I think for me at least, thinking about this particular project, if there's a way for you all to pull out that common thread while not negating or missing the individuality, then I think that will enhance the work that you do. So to get back to the question, and Chris and I have talked about it a little bit before, I think I think MIT students are very different. However, there is a least common denominator, if you would. You know, and because I get the question all the time. Part of my job is to go out and recruit students to MIT at the graduate level. And so everyone's asking, well, what's an MIT student like? Is there a typical MIT student? What's the experience like at MIT? What do people do there? What makes someone special? I do think there is an X factor. I think there's a secret sauce. And to me, the secret sauce is in the least common denominator, and it's sort of made up of a few things. One, and it kind of captures what you were saying, but one is this unapologetic passion. Right? Like most people at MIT are just passionate about something. Now, you may not care about what they're passionate about. You may not have never heard of what they're passionate about. You may not necessarily agree with it. But I think if you walk around the campus, you'll notice that people are really, really passionate about something. Never in my life had I been to any campus and I'd see somebody walking around in a purple flight suit. But you know, you get to MIT and after a while you see somebody walking around or riding on a unicycle in a purple flight suit while juggling, and you just walk by like it's normal. That person is passionate about unicycles, purple flight suits, and juggling. And guaranteed that everyone in this room is passionate about something. I think the other thing is this idea of an immense drive. And you see it, you really, really see it in the students. And I'm sure I know one of you all, I don't know the rest of you all, but if you all are like the one that I do know, then I know you all have an immense drive. Meaning despite like the challenges that come up, whether it's academic, cultural, social, like you really drive towards those things that you're passionate about and you're willing to overcome the barriers. I mean, MIT students are involved in going to Haiti, in the turmoil in the Middle East now, like really real world problems, while at the same time being involved in coming up with new programs for our new systems to allow computers to interact with humans, like you name it. So there's this drive to kind of create and to learn and to do. And I think there is one other factor, and I'm forgetting it, and I don't remember what it is, but it'll come out in the conversation. So I say that to say, I personally believe that there are some common elements among MIT students, and I would love, because I really want to see the work that comes out of this, and I would love to see how you all manage to, while highlighting the individuality, manage to sort of find that common thread amongst students at MIT. I think the other thing I'll say, and then I would love to sort of hear what you all are talking about and get some dialogue, is I kind of wanted to underscore the significance and importance of the work that you're doing. We go about our life without thinking about our life often. We go about our life without thinking about the relationships that we have. And one of the most important components of our life is relationships. And the more we understand and can appreciate the differences of individuals, because it's easy to find somebody that you're common with, right? So I can walk around down the hall, and if I see a black male that has a suit on, that's an easy connection. Hey, how's it going? You know, that's an easy connection. The more difficult connection is with someone that doesn't look like me, that doesn't act like me. And if I can find a way to make that connection, or doesn't think the same way that I do, then what ultimately happens is it enhances who I am. And I think if you all in this project, what I would love to see out of it is sort of how you went about getting outside of your own comfort zone, finding a way to connect with someone that's really different from you. Because in the process of doing that, I think we as MIT could learn how to actually do that. And that's something that we need to learn, not just MIT, but other places too. One of the things that, and I'll end with this, as an undergraduate student, I worked at NASA, and my advisor was Franklin Chang Diaz. He's an astronaut. And when I graduated, I think I may have mentioned this to you before, when I graduated, I was admitted into MIT and had to go back to NASA to work for that summer. And at the end of the summer, I gave a presentation, and we talked, and we were sort of talking about MIT. And one of the things that he said to me that I'll never forget was, when you go to MIT, don't lose your humanity. I didn't quite understand what he was talking about, but having been here for a while, I see that in the midst of our deep drive and in the midst of our endless pursuit of excellence, it's easy to lose our humanity, that sort of that human connection. I think we've done a really good job in the last decade of making sure that students and faculty and staff have that human connection. And I would love to see this project add to what is being done to help us really understand how to maintain that human connection, because that's most important.
Great. And I'll just add one other thing. One of the reasons that we watched the film that we watched, or the selection from it, is that another way that I could have approached making this film would have been to essentially cast students myself and go interview them. And I was somewhat resistant to do that because I was afraid that it would end up being like a more sort of contemporary version of that, which is sort of a top-down look at the student body and what MIT students are like and what they do. And so this is kind of an experiment, and I'm hoping that you'll participate by looking at each other, looking at yourselves. So we'll see what happens, but anyway.
Do you all have any major concerns about the project? Good. Yes.
It's not a concern. I'm just like wondering, and we were talking about some of the issues that MIT could do better, but at the same time we acknowledge that MIT is doing a lot of things that are pioneering a lot of things that other colleges haven't really done yet. So after watching this video, we discussed like at the time it was like, oh wow, there are, for example, 100 women here. So if you were like a woman, you would be really happy. There would be a discussion around that. But then the way we look at it now, it reflects that the reality of how MIT was at that time. So now we're talking about the issues that MIT has right now, and we want to make a video about it. Are we going to touch on those issues? Are we supposed to touch on those issues? So that like if 50 years from now, another class is watching the video that was made from this time, they will be like, oh, like my first impression was like, wow, that's great. It's only been 50 years or 60 years, and we're here. That's awesome. I'm really happy. Would that be reflected in that video, or would that be, or is it something that we know? It's like that's what we should just talk about it. Like,
You mean this video that we're talking about
right,
now?
Like, are we? I don't know. What is there a fine line? Like, how should we think about that?
I hope there's not a fine line. Certainly there shouldn't be a fine line in what you do. I can't tell you that if you find somebody who is the sort of poster child for whatever IHTFP that it's going to be like no problem. But the whole point of this is to erase that fine line or blur it because, as I said, the very simple way to do this project would be for me, with the help of like the Dean of Undergraduate Education or something, to cast students and profile them. And I was resistant to doing that because I thought that there was a danger that it could end up being like a slicker contemporary version of what we watched. So this is, as I said, this is an experiment to try to do something different.
Can I'm sorry, I couldn't
Yeah.
read very well because of how noisy this room is. So basically, your question is,
Are there boundaries?
right? This is,
Yeah.
the film that we saw was very much a PR film from a very top-down point of view, and felt very contrived, and we laughed at a lot of it because a lot of it was amusing. But so, what are the questions we found then? So, if you want to get at this question sort of about MIT students, how do you do it not in that, not in a way that's, that's not about PR, but it's about trying to capture something that's more. We've had so many discussions about the real relation to all this. I don't know if I want to use that language, but how do you get at something that's far more open and evolving, and that's not just sort of a PR look? So that's one of the questions that I have for all of you. Then, I know this exercise we've talked about it some, but not that much. But in terms of actually going about and shooting an interview with students, do you have any ideas of how you might go about shooting or conducting an interview in a way that sort of wouldn't have it be just PR, but actually getting at interesting stuff that you'd be interested in?
And this partly asking you folks to participate is part of my answer, my attempted answer at that very question, because how do you get at those kinds of things? Well, via MIT students is the first part, and the second part is somewhat up to you.
So I think that rather than asking, or in addition to asking people about their experience in MIT, because then when you create a narration, always construct in a certain way, and with the camera you tend to emphasize, I guess, the most positive notes, especially the first time that you are, it's a short interview. So it would be nice to see people in their own space, like walking around the labs or the cafes they go to, or the corridors, the gyms they work at, because I think this walking space brings a different kind of experiential dimension to it, and the kind of stories you tell. They're still stories, they're still narratives, but they reflect more your bodily experience around MIT, so they might tell much more things than a PR like kind of storyline. So I was thinking about doing something like that.
Absolutely. If you look at again the film that we looked at, I talked about how I was really taken by the fact that it was so much about infrastructure. This is Walker Memorial. This is the President's House, but it's all kind of outside in, standing on the outside looking in, and what you're talking about is inside out, which is again exactly what I'd love to get.
And I think that gets at which is why I'm excited about it. I think it gets at that issue of humanity, right? Because you all are there. You're connecting with the students, and the students are the lifeblood of MIT. So the question is, what does the lifeblood of MIT really look like? And I think that's a real question. So I'm excited about seeing what the answer is.
And I will say too, so Christopher runs the MSRP program every summer, which is a program for undergrads to come to MIT and do graduate research. And we do video work with them every summer. And one of the things that he does, which is wonderful, is he gives cameras to their students. And these are not people who are in a film class. They're not people who are trained at all. But they get amazing stuff that we could never get.
Yeah.
So clearly, you're going to have a different perspective just by virtue of who you are. Plus, you're taking this class, so hopefully it's only been a couple months, but you've learned something, right?
So we've talked about lots of different styles or genres of documentary filmmaking and different techniques. So you can think about, so Katarina, what you were talking about is kind of the direct cinema style, where you take the camera, you move around, and you follow people through their spaces, and whether it's labs or dorms or whatever it is. And then we were talking in the last class about Errol Morris and sort of, the interview style, where it's not really about the interviewer's questions, it's about just allowing somebody to kind of get into their own headspace and talk about what they think is important to them. And it could be the focus where the camera's focusing on interactions. So are there certain kinds of student interactions that you would want to convey? So so it would be focusing on a student, but also that student who's very much in interaction with others. And if you wanted to focus on that, what kinds of interactions would you want to focus on? I'm trying to think of other examples of some of the other styles that we've talked about. We still have more to go. We're doing sensory ethnography in the next class, and the sensory ethnography perspective on documentary is really trying to get at the sensory aspects of people's day-to-day worlds. So, for example, if you were working in a lab, and for those of you who saw the DV Lab shorts from the last class, the very first one by Christina is a bit in that mode, where she did this short film about herself working in a lab and the repetitive nature of the lab work, right? So she cut it in a way where it was very fun and enjoyable to watch, but it was very much about, okay, here's the nature of what it's like to work in a lab. So is there a way where you could sort of do a sensory ethnographic perspective on doing an interview with an MIT student, where you would kind of get at sort of a student's sensory experience of what it's like to be at MIT, or to do whatever work it is that they're interested in, whatever they're passionate about? I'm trying to think of, Chris, we think of other techniques.
Well, I mean, there's the Jean Rouch thing. I mean, an interview-based film could be an Errol Morris style film or just a talking head film. But think about Jean Rouch in Chronicle of a Summer. Basically, get people together. Don't be afraid of being involved, inserting yourself in the film, and get people talking. Be intentionally provocative or not, and get people talking about whatever it is that you're interested in, so that in a sense they're almost interviewing each other.
And Jean Rouch also, I mean, think about the technique in Jaguar, where he got together with Don Moret and other people that he wanted to make that film with, and he had them think out a skit that would improvise their lives. So it was based on improvisation, of people improvising and playing with things that they wanted to convey about their own lives. I mean, is there a way to maybe use that technique to get at these questions? I'm trying to think other ones. So the Jean Rouch, direct cinema, sensory ethnography, the Errol Morris interview style.
Veritable.
Now that's a question. How would you do a Veritable take on MIT student?
Well, it would have to be about MIT, not MIT students.
So, Chris, I don't know, you're a bit of a disadvantage because just in terms of sort of what we've already talked about in the class, but we have been trying to go through all these different kinds of documentary styles and techniques for how different ways that students might get at various kinds of questions about science and in terms of filming, science and engineering more broadly. So the idea is to give lots of different examples of how you can do things, and then let students take the tools that they are most excited about and do something really creative with them.
Cool.
And I would just say, and you may have, you already brought this up, but you may have something to say about this too, just thinking about who you, or if it's a group of people, what group you actually talk to or profile is crucial. And there are two things there. I mean, one is, don't just interview your roommate because they're your roommate and it's really easy. But at the same time, you also want to have access. You want to have that comfort level potentially that we've talked about. I mean, you know, as you've all experienced now, you walk into a room of strangers with a camera, and it's very different than walking into a room of strangers without a camera. So there are two tensions there. There's one, filming what you know, filming people that already know you and that you have kind of a rapport with. But two, don't just do that because it's easy. So you know, you're trying to. I guess what I'm hoping is that you'll think about some of the issues that we've talked about today, and come up with a subject that you have a sense will get at some of those things in an unfiltered way. I mean, I'm definitely not interested in the Potemkin Village version of this, but that also challenges you as a filmmaker and as a person.
That's also what Dean Jones was
Yeah,
talking about in
yeah.
terms of getting outside your comfort zone.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just underscore that and say that I would love to see you all lean more towards the side of those that you don't have relationships. I know access is always an issue, sort of any sort of these things. But I think even in the process of having to gain access to some individual or group that you haven't had access to before, is a lot that you can learn from. There's a deep learning experience. There's a book that was just released, and you all came and we put it up on the web when she came and spoke. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns, and it's about the great migration of blacks from the north states to the southern states to the northern states. And there was an individual, Isabel Wilkerson, who interviewed over 1,200 people in order to sort of understand what happened in this process. It happened from the beginning of World War I until about 1970, and over 6 million African Americans moved from the south to the north. But in order to get all these interviews, she had to go through so many different hoops just to get access to people. Because now there are, I don't remember exactly what they call them, but there's sort of groups or committees that are in different places in the north that are based on where people were from in the south. So there's a Hattiesburg, Mississippi club in Chicago. And in order for her to get access to the Hattiesburg, Mississippi club, she had to talk to the people that ran the club. They had to have a meeting, and they had to have a vote on whether or not they were going to give her access to come into the club and sort of interact with them. So you may have to go through some hoops, but even in the process of going through the hoops, I think you'll learn a lot about yourself. You'll learn a lot about other individuals, and I think it'll definitely enrich the project.
So, and one last thing I'll just say about Dean Jones. His office is not sponsoring this project. He's just here because he's interested. Just to make it clear. So this is not. This is as as unfiltered as I can make it, hopefully. But anyway, I know you've got a lot going on. So, but thank you for coming.
I'm excited. Good stuff.
Any questions for Christopher? And we'll talk more about the nitty-gritty of this project later in class.
Cool.
Great. Well, thanks so much.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Don't forget.
Cool. Nice to meet you all. Good luck with everything.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, well, why don't we take just a short break, and then when we come back, we're going to dive into some more specific kinds of interview techniques that you can use just in terms of thinking about how to conduct an interview, how to set things up technically, and then we can also try to go over some of the specifics of this project. Thanks. We'll get started here, and the first thing I want to do is just run through some sort of basic considerations that you'll want to be thinking about when you tackle an interview-based project. And again, interview-based being interpreted fairly broadly as anything from a talking head-based project, as quote unquote, like an Errol Morris film, through something that's a little more interactive, something like we saw in Chronicle of a Summer, and anything in between. So obviously, if you're going to do anything like that's interview-based, audio becomes really, really crucial. And if you remember early on, one of the things that I said was that sometimes sound is more important than picture. And this is a situation in which that becomes really true. Obviously, if you can't hear what the interview is saying, or if it's poorly recorded, or somehow something goes wrong, you don't really have a lot to work with. So I don't know, have all of you had a chance to play around with the lavalier microphone, or have you been mainly using the boom at this point? Just the boom. Has anybody messed with the lavalier? You? Okay. So this is a situation in which you may want to consider using the lavalier. And remember again that the lavalier microphone is omnidirectional, which means that it's really great at picking up sound in any direction from where it's located. So in a relatively quiet room where you can put it fairly close to the person's mouth, it's a great microphone for an interview. I'm wearing one right now. Chris is wearing one right now. It's very close to me. This one, of course, is wireless, which is really great. But we don't have wireless. So thinking about and making sure that you are comfortable with a lavalier microphone might be something to consider. Now, again, of course, if you're doing something where the person's walking around in a space, walking and talking, as Katerina was talking about, that isn't necessarily going to work as well, primarily because we have wired microphones. Although you can try it. I mean, I've done it myself. It just means that the person is tethered to the camera, which can be awkward. And if, again, if you're concerned about impacting the scene and making the person feel uncomfortable, that is something that would make anyone feel uncomfortable. Go ahead.
I mean, maybe at the end, if you guys are interested, maybe we can have, if there's time at the end, have Dave or you go over using the shotgun mics on top of these cameras, so exactly how you set them up. So you're ready to do that. So if you want to have better sound, but you want it just on the camera without wires.
Now remember the thing about putting the directional microphone on top of the camera, that actually can be a pretty good interview technique as long as you can stay fairly close to the person, and also as long as you can stay pointed at their mouth. Because if they turn their back on you, if you're walking through a space, their sound is going to pretty much disappear. Because this is so directional that it's not going to pick up anything except what's bouncing back at the microphone from whatever surface is in front of them, like a wall.
How close should we be?
Maybe 4 or 5 feet. 3 feet would be great. What is that, about 4 feet? That's probably about 4 feet is as far as you want to be.
So say technically, if they're walking, would have to be either on the side?
On the side or in front, walking backwards, yeah.
Walking backwards.
Yeah, that would be great. Walking backwards would be the ideal way to do it. Yeah, very difficult. If you're planning on following someone behind and you want to get good sound of them talking, you're pretty much stuck with either a lavalier microphone or the boom, because of course the boom can go over the top of the person or to the side. So that's one thing. Just thinking about how you're going to mic the people and considering using the lavalier if it is in fact going to be kind of a sit-down interview. Second thing to think about is, do you mic yourself? Do you want your questions to be part of what you record? And obviously, that is completely your choice. There's a whole school of filmmaking where the interviewer is cut out, and the questions are not part of what's used. And in that case, you don't need to mic yourself. You can just, obviously, they can hear you. There's no reason to record what you're saying. What that means, though, is that you need to get people to answer in incomplete thoughts. So anyway, so do you mic yourself? If you want to have your questions be part of the record, part of what you're going to use, you obviously do need to mic yourself. And you could do that with the lavalier and then use the shotgun microphone to record the person, for instance, or vice versa. You should put yourself on a separate channel, though. So you can put the interviewee on channel 1 and you on channel 2, so that way you can control them separately in the edit. And you have 2 inputs, which we've gone over in class, and obviously we can review that if you need to. But to get back to the idea then, if you don't mic yourself and you don't want to include the questions, you really need people to say everything that you need said in order to tell whatever story it is that you're telling. So again, to go back to this thing that we're about to say with Chris, if I am interviewing Chris and I'm basically trying to tell her life story, and I say, when were you born? And she says 1965. I can't really use that because all she said was 1965. She has to say, I was born in 1965.
So you would ask questions that imply an answer, just a full sentence, like tell me about
Yeah. So
your childhood.
and I
should say I was born in.
exactly. And I also sometimes I will just be very upfront with people, and I will say, try to answer in complete thoughts.
So like before you start the interview, to alert them.
Yeah.
To
So
that.
you know,
But people
like,
forget.
and I'll explain. You know, I'm not going to be. No one's going to hear my question. So can you please answer in complete thoughts? And people are usually pretty good about that. One technique that people also use, which can be a little dangerous, is they will say, "Can you incorporate the question in the answer?" So what happens then is people say, you ask, "What are MIT students like?" And they say, "When someone asks me, what are MIT students like, I usually say," and so you can see the difficulty. On the one hand, it's good because you get the context for the answer. But on the other hand, it's kind of formulaic and it's a little weird. So if, you know, to go back to the 1965 example, if Chris said, "When someone asks me when were you born, I usually say 1965. So it can get a little weird.
Yeah.
But it is one way to do it, and it's kind of reliable because people get it and they're able to do it.
But I think Katerina was also right on in terms of trying to think of how can you ask questions that are sort of general enough where
exactly.
kind of intuitively that kind of information would be part of the story that people tell.
And that's just a basic of interviewing, asking open-ended questions. Not, do you like MIT? Do you like MIT? Yes. Or no. So thinking about what kind of questions you need to get the kinds of answers that you actually want. And they tend to be very, very open-ended. Tell me about your experience at MIT. And then you can ask follow-ups. And the follow-up is kind of the real art, I think, in interviewing, because you go in with a list of questions that you have in your mind that you think are really important. Maybe, maybe you've shared them with the person you're interviewing. Maybe you haven't. And there are two schools of thought on that. If you share them, then they may be much better prepared, and that may be a good thing. On the other hand, they may be much better prepared, and that may be a bad thing. It just depends on kind of what you're going for. If you want somebody to talk in detail about their research and to provide statistics and all sorts of specific information, you really want them to be prepared. On the other hand, if you want them to speak candidly about their life, you may not want them to be prepared. Because not that you want to put them on the spot, but you want to have them thinking about it fresh for the first time as they're answering the question, if that makes sense. And of course, it also depends on the person. I mean, some people are really obsessive about preparation and get very nervous and upset when you try to do that. And some people are much better spontaneously. But to do a really good interview that isn't necessarily about specific information or statistics, part of your job as an interviewer is to create an environment where people can be spontaneous and they are comfortable. And one of those things maybe not, you know, one of the elements of creating that environment maybe not giving them questions in advance. So there isn't necessarily a right or a wrong answer to that, but it really varies and depends on. Were you going to say something?
Well, I just had just a follow-up on when you were talking about what kinds of questions to ask, and so Chris gave a really good example. Tell me about your experience at MIT. You know, and the good thing about that is that it's open-ended, but the other thing that's good about that is it's also specific. Because one of the things, there's a tendency, particularly for those of us trained as academics, we often tend to ask abstract questions, where if you phrase it instead of telling me about your experience at MIT, if it's instead, well, we're trying to capture what might be the ideal, typical MIT student, and has there been a, you know, like in this kind of abstracted way, and then
Right.
and then you ask an abstracted kind of intellectual question, and people are kind of like, how do you want me to respond? Like, you know, it's not a good interviewing technique, and particularly people trained in academics have to be really careful about this. But so finding a question that's both open-ended, but also very specific and grounded, like tell me about your experience at MIT. Right?
And the
that's
follow-up
perfect.
question, you know, I mentioned that the follow-up question is really important, or questions. That's why, because if you say, tell me about your experience at MIT, and they start talking about things, then you can take what they're saying and spontaneously yourself follow up on the things that are interesting and that start to key into whatever your approach is. And of course, you also need to be prepared to throw your approach out the window if it doesn't seem to be the right way to go. One thing that I might have mentioned this before at the beginning in the first class, but years ago I saw an interview with Errol Morris where he talked about interview techniques, and he said somewhat provocatively, because he's provocative, and facetiously, that the main thing in doing an interview is not to listen to what the people are saying, but to appear that you're listening. And I think what he meant by that was that if you're listening too much, if you're listening too hard, because obviously you were listening, there's a real desire to direct the interview along particular channels that you have planned out in advance. So let's say you're doing something about MIT students, and the whole point of it is to find out what kind of cooking people like, where they eat lunch. And so all you're interested in is finding out where people eat lunch, what they eat lunch, how they do it, how they organize it. And people might be giving you amazing material and amazing gems of things on other subjects, but you're continually thinking in your head, you're calculating, yeah, but what about lunch? Tell me about lunch, come on. And they're sort of laying out their life story and saying all this amazing stuff. And all you're focused on with tunnel vision is the questions that you want answered. And that is very, very true, especially when you're doing kind of journalistic, directed interviews. There is a real tendency to want to do that and to very tightly control and direct the interview. And what he's saying, I think, in that comment is throw that stuff out the window so that when some kind of amazing thing happens in the interview, if you're not really listening to it, then it'll just happen. And you won't try to force it or jam it into the subject that you had preordained.
The slightly less extreme version of that would be sort of an anthro take on this, where as opposed to the, okay, here's my questions, they haven't answered, I've only gotten to one, and they haven't answered 3, 4, and 5, and as Chris is saying, you really try to direct them. But the kind of, for anthropologists who do ethnographic fieldwork, what we get trained to do is that, again, what's interesting is what's interesting to your subjects, and to following where they're going. So in that case, it's actually listening very intently, but listening with the intent not because you want to direct them in a certain way, but listening with the intent of trying to understand, well, what is it that's interesting to them? And how can I potentially ask questions to help push it along in that direction of what's interesting to them? So you're constantly, it's not about, as Chris is saying, it's not about sort of your preordained conceptions when you're coming in about what you should be asking, but what's important to this person and how can I sort of help unearth what it is that they find most interesting. So it's questions towards a different kind of end, and it's always about being in response and interacting with what people themselves feel to be important.
And the other thing I think that is true, whether you look at it as don't listen at all or listen very intently, is that when you're really on an agenda as an interviewer, you have a tendency to sort of want to knock things off the list. So if the first question is tell me about your MIT experience, they talk, and you're okay, next one is about where do you have lunch, and you're okay, I got to get to the next question. You have a tendency to jump in as it seems that they're finishing with the next question. But what I found, and I mean, I've done like over 100 interviews this year, so I do this a lot. People have a tendency, there's kind of a rhythm of speech where they finish, and then if you wait a moment, they'll continue. And usually when they continue, it's the sort of deeper, kind of more personal, more sort of unexpected answer. Because there's something about it, where there's a rhythm of conversation. I say something, Chris says something, I say something, Chris says something. Well, if that rhythm is broken and suddenly it's more on the person who's speaking, that can be the moment when something else comes out. So there's a technical reason not to jump as well, which is that you don't want to overlap the audio. You don't want their audio and yours to overlap because that can cause a problem in editing, particularly if you're trying to cut your questions out. But also waiting a beat just to see if they have something else to say is often giving them permission to say something else. And that can be some of the most interesting and unexpected stuff. So, so again, not really trying to forcibly direct the interview, although of course you are directing it, is really important. Just a couple of other things. I mean, so we were talking. I think I said that probably job number one as an interviewer is to make people feel comfortable and to make them feel like it's sort of that they have permission to speak and to say things that are natural and kind of possibly unexpected. One really good way of doing that is thinking very carefully about how you're going to start the interview, especially for people who aren't comfortable with being on camera or aren't used to being on camera. There's a real tendency, particularly when you're working on a bigger production with a lot of equipment, that everything gets focused on the equipment. So the camera gets set up. If you have lights, you're setting up the lights, the audio. The poor person who you're going to interview is sitting there, and they're a guinea pig for the lights, and you're adjusting everything. Maybe you're slapping makeup on them. You're putting a microphone on them. You're asking them to do an audio test. You know, what's the level like? 1, 2, 1, 2. Can you say that again? Speak a little louder. And they get very uncomfortable, of course, because it's this big deal. But if you can do that more unobtrusively, and obviously one of the nice things is we hardly have any equipment in this class compared to you know, the load like that. So doing it unobtrusively is very, very helpful to setting the tone for a more natural interview. And then the other thing is how you start it. If all of that kind of complicated setup and running around leads up to, okay, are we ready? Are we ready? Everyone rolling? Okay, all right, begin. Be natural. Go now. That is obviously going to put a lot of people on the spot and make them very uncomfortable. On the other hand, and this is another reason for working in teams, even if you don't have a lot of stuff, if one person is doing all of the technical setup and framing the shot and setting up the camera and working with audio, and the other person who's going to be doing the interview is chatting with the person the whole time, and then if the camera just naturally starts rolling and you continue your conversation, then suddenly it's become an interview without any kind of like, go, now you're on, now we started. And that can be really, really helpful, as I said, especially for people that are not really used to being on camera. Because, you know, you think about it, we've had the experience of being filmed in this class off and on over the last couple of months, and how different is it when the cameras aren't here, or when we forget that the cameras are here. So the point is that you want to erase the camera from the room as much as possible, and the way to do that is to, as Chris has said a couple of times, have a human subject for them to focus their attention on while the technical stuff is happening, and that isn't so maximized.
Just unless you're intended to do something like Jean Ruchian,
well,
where
yeah,
the
right,
idea
yeah.
then in that case then it's then, I mean, because that could be another way to do it then, where you want it to be about the interaction with the camera, but it's meant to be a dialogue, a discussion back and forth, and then you got a whole other way of thinking about the interview. But that could be another way to do it, where it's like, okay, it's a conversation between the camera and this person.
Yep. So just want to throw out a few kind of video considerations as well. We've been talking a lot about audio and interview techniques. Again, remember that doing an interview-based film, that's very broadly conceived. I mean, something that is sort of Errol Morris-like, or what we think of as a conventional talking head interview, is one option, and that generally involves having a camera on a tripod and having the person either looking into the lens or at an interviewer sitting next to the camera, just off axis from the lens. And that's a perfectly great way to do things. But it's not the only way to do things. I mean, you talked about having people walking through a space and talking, some kind of environmental interview, a handheld interview where the camera's actually mobile, even if the person's not mobile. All of those are other options, and they're all perfectly valid choices. You just need to think about what is the option that communicates what you're hoping to communicate. You know, is this kind of a controlled setting? Is it an uncontrolled setting? Do you want some fluidity? Do you want them to be interacting with their environment? Or are you going to get the interaction with the environment separately? Are you going to interview them in a more controlled space and then film them doing the stuff that they're talking about? And I'll talk about that in a minute. So that's one thing, just thinking about about the techniques that you're going to use in the interview to convey a feeling that you want to convey. If you are doing something that is a tripod-based kind of standard video interview, you want to think about the framing of the people. We talked about framing, if you remember, this idea that the really powerful parts of the frame are the corners where the frame is divided into thirds. Did a bad job there, but these are very powerful parts of the frame because our eyes tend to be drawn to those points. So the standard way of framing someone, which is, and when I say standard, I mean that sounds kind of pejorative, like, oh well, we don't want to be standard, but this actually, it works really well. Framing somebody looking this way on this side of the frame so that their eye is more or less in that point, or alternatively framing somebody looking that way. So one of their eyes is at that point. And that's just a really sort of good, appealing way of framing people. And then remembering also, go down. There we go. If you have somebody framed like that, what's the relationship between the person's face and the background? The last thing you want is for the person's face to blend into the background. And there are a number of ways that you can avoid that. I mean, there's lighting, if you have light, obviously. You don't want the background to be much brighter than the person's face, for example. What you really want is for the background to fade in some way so that the face kind of jumps out. And that's why, for instance, we've talked about long lenses being very good, appealing ways of shooting people, particularly in interview situations. What that does is it allows you to have the face be in very sharp focus and the background to be soft and out of focus. And that, again, is a way of having the face jump out. So focus, of course, is critical, always critical, but particularly critical when you're shooting people. What you want to do is zoom in all the way to the person's face, to their eye, because you always want to focus to the eye. Focus very carefully, and then you can zoom out to whatever frame you want. Also, thinking about varying the frame. This is kind of a medium close shot, but you could just as easily, film people in a wider shot, a very wide shot. Or, you could do the frontline 60 minutes thing and film people in a very close shot. Or you could do all of them. You could move the camera or zoom in and out.
I have a technical question. So, like in Gates of Heaven, when Errol Morris has those amazing, I know you weren't rewatching it, but you've seen it a zillion times. But when he does those amazing portraits, and then in the background you have the cacti or whatever it is, but the faces are totally clear, but the background is also totally, popped. So how exactly did he shoot that in order to get that?
Yeah,
like
because
that?
that's another. I mean, again, he's not doing a lot of the standard things in that film. So the backgrounds aren't out of focus. What he's doing is carefully orchestrating what is in the background so that it's completely vivid, but also not completely fighting the face. So you can do it with art direction as well. There is something back here that is really vivid and kind of dynamic, but it's not competing, just by the nature of the framing, it's not competing with the foreground. So art direction is another way to do this. One thing to just note about art direction, this is just a personal thing of mine, there is such a thing as being kind of too on the nose with art direction. And what I mean is, let's say you're doing something on lab safety, okay? and you interview somebody, and there's a sign in the background that says, you know, like radiation. And it's completely sharp and in focus, and this person is talking about radiation. That's kind of on the nose. Now, it might work if this is like a, you know, a radiation symbol and it's completely soft and not distracting. But there's something about kind of text and sort of establishing your subjects in a very, very sort of obvious and overt way that can get a little weird for me. And there are also, you know, there's sort of like things in the background that can be distracting, unintentionally distracting. That's always something to consider as well. You know, the classic is, I don't know if you saw this, but I think it was last year or the year before, Sarah Palin gave an interview at Thanksgiving when she was still governor of Alaska, and they were slaughtering turkeys behind her. And there's this like completely sharp focus shot of this guy slaughtering turkeys and staring at her, you know, and she's talking about Thanksgiving and the beauty of the holiday and so on. And it was just hilarious. And it was hilarious because there was this, you know, utterly distracting and bizarre event happening behind her that the camera person didn't really think about. Or you can do that for a comic effect.
Or did intentionally.
Or, well, yeah, good question. I don't know. But, you know, and obviously you can do that intentionally. You know, you can have something going on in the background that comments on the foreground intentionally, either comically, it ends up being comic, or not. So anyway, these are all things to think about when you're setting up kind of a quote-unquote talking head interview. The other thing which we've talked a little bit about in class are lighting techniques. I mean, obviously we don't have lights, but that doesn't mean that you can't use light or shouldn't use light to do you know, better jobs with your interviews. Well, Max can tell you can find lights that can be used. And he did that a couple of times, basically using like desk lights, clip lights, things like that. And that's one option. The big thing to think about there is not making things too harsh, not making your shadows really harsh or creating weird lighting effects on the people unless you're doing it intentionally. But if you're doing natural light, thinking about, which we've talked about it before, but just to reiterate, thinking about where the light sources are and how that affects the person you're filming. So again, in this room, if I was getting interviewed in the room by Andrew, which I am, if I stood in front of the window like this, especially if the blinds are up, I suddenly get backlit. And suddenly my face is not bright in the frame at all compared to the background. But if I come over here and I stand under, I'm positioned under this light so that suddenly I'm in a pretty good spot, my face is brighter than the background, which is the board, okay? So you can position people in various ways to take advantage of that. And, you know, harsh lighting makes people look one way. Softer lighting, like, you know, one of the nice things about this kind of material is that it breaks up light really nicely. So this is a very nice, soft light that makes people look really nice. So one thing you could do, which we can't really demonstrate with this camera, is I could be interviewed this way with window light on me, and the camera could be facing here. So now I have this really nice, soft light source lighting me, and it would actually be a really, potentially very nice way of doing it. So you don't be afraid to position people and to use the environment around you to get what you want. And of course, being outside, the same thing. I mean, you could film somebody outside at sunset with the sun low in the sky behind them, and suddenly they're silhouetted. Or you could turn them around, and then you have this sort of golden light on them. And those are choices that you can make. So anyway, thoughts or questions about this point? Okay. One other thing that I wanted to do, and then maybe in the last 15 or 20 minutes, we can sort of just kind of go over if there are sort of just basic technical questions about the camera or sound that people want to sort of reiterate. I wanted to kind of revisit this idea of kind of, I guess, is the word illustrating interviews. I mean, you know, the sort of the question of, okay, so you've done an interview, how do you actually make it come alive? And one way to do it, of course, is to do something, as Katerina was talking about, just interview somebody in situ, right? Have them walking around describing what they do, and have it be very fluid and very mobile. The other way to do it, of course, is to interview them and then go out and do kind of what Errol Morris does, get material that reinforces or reiterates or explicates what they're talking about. So if somebody's talking about the biolab that they work in, you do a half-hour interview with them about the biolab, and then you go to the lab and you shoot them working, doing the things that they were talking about, kind of illustrating the kind of important things that were discussed in the interview. And that's a great way to, that's a great sequence to do it in. Do an interview first, and then go and think about what you need in order to tell the story that came out in the interview. The nice thing about that is that it doesn't kind of prejudice the interview, so that you can be very exploratory in the interview, and then you can kind of go and get exactly what you need to tell the story. The other way to do it, of course, is to film the sort of kind of verite stuff, the sort of mobile stuff first, and then do interviews that connect the dots to the mobile stuff. And I wanted to show a short film that I worked on a few years ago, which is completely shifting gears in terms of genre. It's a mockumentary. It's a very low-budget mockumentary, like so a fake documentary that I worked on, and it stars Ed Helms, and it was done on a very, very low budget, very, very quickly. And because it was all completely improvised, we did the opposite. We basically filmed all of the, and I'm not going to tell you too much about it, but we filmed all the walking around first, and then we did the interview second, because since he's a really amazing improv actor, he was able to kind of connect all the dots. But I'm just going to show it quickly. Then we can talk about it. And it's a profile. It's not an MIT student, but it is a profile. I just wanted to show that, first of all, because it was done not too much with too much more time and resources than we have here. We shot it really, really quickly in Brooklyn one day, one Sunday afternoon. And it was the opposite of what we were just talking about. We went out with Ed and just, after he was done with his makeup, which took about as long as the shooting, we just wandered around Brooklyn, and we knew that we had a couple of scenarios, like he was going to go play basketball and that he would be stood up on a date. But we didn't really know what else we were going to do. And then we went back and did an interview which connected all the dots. And because he's, an improv actor and really good at it, he was able to tie it all together for us. So anyway, there's just that whole question of how do you tell a story? What's the story you're going to tell? This was a situation where, again, other than the basic scenarios and the fact that he was a zombie and that it was going to be about the daily life struggles of a zombie done in this, kind of particular way, we didn't really have a story. So I guess the last couple things, just to kind of go over again next week, you've all done the direct cinema exercise. The idea now is to do an interview-based exercise, as we've been discussing. And next week, if one person in each team could edit one or the other, a version. I mean, obviously, it doesn't have to be, the be-all, end-all, but as kind of completely as you can, put together something. Doesn't have to be more than a few minutes long, that is a best guess at kind of what you were trying to do with each of the exercises. So does that make sense? Questions about that? All right, so then just the last thing, I wanted to leave enough time to sort of deal with specific technical questions that may have come up either about camera or sound recording.
One other thing, I mean, unless somebody had something else they wanted to say, but you had asked earlier about sort of moving, doing handheld, and moving with somebody, and then the questions then about, you know, how do you get, if you've got the shotgun mic on top, how do you keep getting sound? And Chris was talking about walking backwards. So just one follow-up technical thing on that. It's a really good technique to learn how to do to walk backwards. I would practice first. And you should be particularly careful with your ankle.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, I mean, never do it unassisted. At least if there's any kind of question about the terrain or bumping into something. No, seriously. I mean, you can fall downstairs. You can fall, you know, break cameras, break your, you know, sorry, you know, break something on you. You just don't want to do it. I mean, usually what we do when we're walking backwards is, again, you're working in teams of two. So here, if Chris is walking backwards with the camera, you know, I'm here and I'm doing this, you know, like, okay, you know, step, step, step. You know, so, you know, moving things out of the way, making sure that, you know, telling her if there's something that she's going to bump into, or tapping her to move this way. And that's just something you really want to do because, you know, again, you get so involved in the shooting, you get so involved in the shot you're taking that even if you know very well that there's a table of glassware behind you, you're almost guaranteed to run into it.
We have some really funny footage.
Oh, is this the tree?
Yeah, we were shooting in East Africa on this little island where I had done my field work. And Chris was we were walking up a path and there were all these coconut trees. And so Chris was shooting handheld, walking backwards. And we have the sound of like, like when he hits the coconut tree, it goes splat. So we'd actually spent a lot of time maneuvering the coconut trees, but that particular one. So yeah, it's a really great technique to have, and it really frees you up to be able to do stuff more handheld, which can be really fun. I mean, again, it's all about what you want to capture. Do you want to do kind of the Errol Morris type thing? Do you want to do the kind of movement? But if you do want to be able to do stuff that's sort of more mobile, learning those kinds of techniques, and so just practicing them, maybe with having a friend spot you, is a good idea.
Thinking about kind of how the shot changes. I mean, again, I mean the little thing we just watched actually is a good example of this. So stand up again. So basically, I walked all over Park Slope with Ed and Nick and the sound guy.
Oh, so when you're on the street?
And yeah, so I walked backwards a lot, and Nick Poppy, the director, was, you know, guiding me. But then I would come around out to the side and walk next to Ed. Or I would walk behind him. You know, he would do his thing where he would interact with people, and I would find another angle. Right. And you know, Nick would know to sort of step out of the way and kind of just make sure he wasn't in the shot. And then if I started walking backwards again, he would run in and you know, start guiding again.
Great.
So it's just staying very fluid and just remembering that, you know, you can change shots. You can change from one kind of shot to another kind of shot. You can film feet, you can film cutaways, you can film point of view. So another thing that you might do is if you're walking backwards, filming this person walking through the environment, you can flip around and all of a sudden you're shooting the point of view of that person. So you can shoot kind of what's happening on the street, what's ahead, then rotate back, film here, go behind, go over the shoulder of the person, film a profile. And the main thing there, again, is to think about holding the shots long enough so that there actually is something there to use. If you're continually moving and changing, you end up with nothing. It's kind of the equivalent of hosing down the room. But you know, definitely don't lock yourself into one kind of angle. Try to be aware of what's interesting and what's going on, and try to change angles to do that. And that was one of the things that also that I wanted to show that was fun about that piece, even though it obviously is a mockumentary, it was very much unscripted. Other than the fact that we knew we had permission from that restaurant to film in the restaurant at a particular time of day, we didn't really have an agenda.
So that, in some ways, is very similar to the Jean Rouge technique, say in Jaguar, where you get together and you kind of decide, okay, here's certain parameters, there's a couple things we want to do, and then the rest of it is improv along the way. In the last 5 minutes, since people might want the flexibility to do that, should we get out a shotgun mic? Do you want to show how to put them onto the camera?
Yeah, maybe. Is that something that people are interested in finding out about? Because that is a great sort of intermediary technique, and it's definitely better than the mic that comes with the camera. So anyway, this mic fits in to the same place, but one thing you'll notice right away when you try it is that it's too loose. So what we usually do, we don't have it here, but we have that blue paper tape, the painter's tape, that you can get a roll of, and you can wrap it around the mic. The nice thing about that painter's tape is that it comes off very easily. I wouldn't use masking tape or Scotch tape or tape that is hard to peel off. But that blue painter's tape, you can wrap it around and build up the thickness of the microphone so that it actually does fit relatively snugly in here because it's close. It's just a little bit off.
And there's painter tape in DV Lab that you can use if you want.
What's that?
I'm just telling you there's painter's tape in DV Lab. That
right. So if you want to do this, just take a roll of painter's tape when you check out your equipment.
There's tons of it too.
Yeah.
Extension back there with just the tape. You guys need some.
We got a lot. Yeah. The other issue that you're going to run into, however, and this is a little trickier, is that on a wide angle, this sags into the frame. So especially, I mean, even if it's built up and it's like that, on the widest angle, this is going to be in the frame, and you're going to need to think of a way to deal with that. One thing that I've done, which has a slight downside, is you can take another piece of tape and angle this up just a little bit. Angling it up that much is enough to have it clear the frame. But of course now you're pointing up a little bit, so you're a little bit off axis unless you're filming Dave, in which case it's perfect. So that's one thing. Other people did other things, like somebody I think managed to actually secure it to the top of the mount like that. You just need to be sure that it's secure, because I don't want it obviously to fall off. And the other thing is it needs to be pretty snugly attached, because if it does this a lot, you're going to get sound problems. You're going to get a lot of interference with the microphone. Because remember, it's just like the boom, handling noise, like the mic shaking around, bumping into things, hand on the boom or hand on the mic, all of that comes out as interference. So anyway, so that is a potential way to do it if you can do it securely with the tape. And that, again, is just enough to get it out of the frame. And that way it's still pointing forward. So that actually is another pretty good option. I don't know if we've ever tried this or if it's even doable, but
Just cutting into the foam itself.
well, I don't want him to cut the foam.
No, I meant use it like this.
Yeah, I was just going to do that, yeah. I don't know if that actually fits, though.
Could you tape over?
Yeah, another option maybe, which I haven't tried, would be to do something like that. Bring it back just far enough, and then you can't close that.
If you use some of the tape to sort of tighten it a little bit.
Right.
Restrict it.
Right. Or the other thing you could do is push the foam forward and bring it back. The only thing here, you don't want to cover the pickups. Remember, these slots on the sides of the mic actually are audio pickups. So you don't want to have those in the mount like that. So you could go back right to that point like that, but anything further back is going to become kind of a problem for you. But anyway, so there is a bit of a technical challenge. There are a couple of ways of getting around it, but it is a way for you to avoid that issue of the boom being so intrusive. It's more limited, though, than the boom, because although you're getting a nice, so from here I could get pretty decent audio of Dave. Back here, not so much. I mean, it'll be better than the camera mic, but it's not going to be fantastic. And of course, I also can't come over the top. I can't, I don't have any reach. So, if with the boom, I can be back here filming you two, and then the boom person can be like this. But of course, you two may be very ill at ease with this thing hanging over your head. So it's a trade-off.
The benefit of doing the 45-degree angle from above
Yeah,
is
definitely.
that you don't get the ambient noise behind the person.
Right.
Well, not much of it anyway.
Well, again, remember, these are very directional. So if I'm filming Dave on a loading dock and there's a truck idling behind him, I'm going to pick up the microphone, the truck really, really well. If I'm coming in like this, I'm not really so much, because the pattern is down. But I'm still going to hear his sound. So that's another consideration. But this is something that we've done very successfully that's less obtrusive, and it's definitely worth knowing and thinking about, and it's a good technique for certain kinds of situations.